cross that threshold from chimp-like communication to something recognizably like language? This is one of the most hotly debated questions in all of science, and I mean hotly. Careers have been built and destroyed on this question. The Linguistic Society of Paris actually banned papers on the origin of language in 1866 because the speculation had gotten so out of hand and so untethered from evidence that they basically said, "Enough, we're not talking about this anymore." That ban held more or less for over a century. It wasn't until the 1990s that the question really became scientifically respectable again, partly because new tools, genetics, brain imaging, computational modeling, gave researchers actual evidence to work with instead of just armchair speculation. The current thinking, and I want to emphasize that this is still very much a work in progress, is that something like modern language probably emerged somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Africa. But the precursors, the building blocks, go back much further than that. Let's talk about those building blocks because they're really interesting. One of them is simply the anatomy of the throat. You need very specific physical equipment to produce the range of sounds that human language requires. Your larynx, your voice box, sits lower in your throat than it does in any other primate. That's important because it creates a longer pharyngeal cavity, which is the space above your vocal cords, and that longer space gives you the ability to shape a much wider range of vowel sounds. A chimp's larynx sits high, like a human infant's, which is actually why babies can breathe and swallow at the same time. And you can't. Your larynx descended as you grew, which gave you speech, but took away that particular trick. And here's the kicker. That descended larynx is actually dangerous. It's the reason humans choke on food. No other primate routinely chokes to death while eating. We do, because the same anatomical change that gave us speech also made our airway and our food pipe cross in a way that creates risk. Evolution kept that trade-off, which tells you something about how valuable speech must have been. The survival advantage of being able to talk was so enormous that it was worth the occasional death by choking. There's another piece of anatomy worth mentioning: the hypoglossal canal. This is a small channel in the base of your skull through which the hypoglossal nerve passes. That nerve controls your tongue, and in humans, it's much larger than in other primates because our tongue does incredibly complex, precise movements when we speak. Think about the difference between saying la and ra. Your tongue is doing something subtly but critically different, and your brain is controlling that with extraordinary precision. When researchers looked at fossil skulls, they found that the hypoglossal canal starts getting noticeably larger in Homo heidelbergensis and Homo sapiens, maybe 300,000 to 600,000 years ago. That doesn't prove those species could speak, but it suggests their tongues were capable of finer motor control. The hardware was coming online, so to speak. And then there's the brain. This is where it gets really interesting, because language isn't just about making sounds. It's about processing meaning, about grammar, about holding a sentence in your working memory while you figure out what the next word should be. There are specific regions of the brain that are heavily involved in language processing. The two most famous are Broca's area, which is involved in producing speech, and Wernicke's area, which is involved in comprehending it. These were identified in the 19th century through some remarkable and somewhat grim clinical work. Paul Broca, a French physician, studied a patient in 1861 who could understand language perfectly but could only produce a single syllable: tan. When the patient died and Broca examined his brain, he found damage to a specific region of the left frontal lobe. A few years later, Karl Wernicke, a German neurologist, identified patients who could speak fluently, but whose speech made no sense. They'd produce grammatically correct sentences that were pure gibberish, and found damage in a different area, further back in the left hemisphere. Now, you can't look at a fossil skull and see Broca's area. Brains don't fossilize, but skulls do, and the inner surface of a skull preserves faint impressions of the brain's surface. These are called endocasts. Paleoneurologists, and yes, that's a real job, and honestly a pretty cool one, have studied endocasts of early human ancestors and found that the regions corresponding to Broca's area show signs of reorganization and expansion going back perhaps 2 million years to Homo habilis. That doesn't mean Homo habilis was giving speeches, but it suggests that the neural architecture that would eventually support language was being laid down, brick by brick, over an almost unimaginably long period of time. There's also a gene worth knowing about, FOXP2. It was discovered in the 1990s when researchers at Oxford studied a family known as the KE family, about half of whose members had severe difficulties with speech and language. The affected family members had a mutation in this one gene, FOXP2, on chromosome 7. When the gene was sequenced and compared across species, something remarkable emerged. The human version of FOXP2 differs from the chimpanzee version by just 2 amino acids, 2 tiny changes. But those changes appear to have been strongly selected for in the human lineage sometime in the last few 100,000 years. And when researchers looked at Neanderthal DNA extracted from fossils, they found that Neanderthals had the same human version of FOXP2, which raises this tantalizing possibility that Neanderthals, too, may have had some capacity for language. We don't know. We can't know. Not really. But the genetics hint at it. So picture this. Somewhere in Africa, hundreds of thousands of years ago, there are beings who look more or less like us. Their throats have reshaped. Their tongues have become more dexterous. Their brains have reorganized in ways that allow for more complex processing of sequential information. They live in groups. They hunt cooperatively. They make tools, not just simple ones, but tools that require multiple steps to produce, which itself implies a capacity for planning and sequential thinking that's not so different from grammar. And somewhere in all of this, something clicks. Someone makes a sound that doesn't just express an emotion or signal a danger. It refers to something. It stands for something. It's a symbol, and someone else understands it. We will never know who that person was, or when exactly it happened, or whether it happened once or 1,000 times in 1,000 different groups. But that moment, that first moment of symbolic reference, when a sound became a word, is arguably the most important moment in the entire history of our species, more important than fire, more important than the wheel. Because once you have symbols, once you can point at the world with your voice and have someone else see what you're pointing at, everything changes. You can teach, you can plan, you can remember together, you can lie, which is its own kind of breakthrough. You can imagine things that don't exist and describe them to someone else, and then the two of you can build them. But the thing is, having words is only the beginning. Words by themselves are just labels. What makes human language truly extraordinary is what happens when you start combining them. When you develop rules for putting words together in ways that create meaning greater than the sum of the parts. And that brings us to something linguists have spent the last century trying to understand, something that a young scholar named Noam Chomsky blew wide open in the 1950s when he proposed an idea so radical that it fundamentally rewired how we think about language itself. Chomsky was barely 26 years old when he published Syntactic Structures in 1957, and the book was thin, barely 100 pages. But the shockwave it sent through linguistics, psychology, philosophy, and eventually computer science is hard to overstate. Here was this young professor at MIT, trained partly in mathematics, and he looked at the way linguists had been studying language up to that point and essentially said, "You're all doing it wrong." Now, to understand why that was such a big deal, you have to know what linguistics looked like before Chomsky showed up. The dominant school of thought in American linguistics at the time was structuralism, heavily influenced by a man named Leonard Bloomfield. Bloomfield and his followers believed that the proper way to study language was from the outside in. You observe what people actually say, you catalog the sounds, you classify the patterns, and you build your description of the language from that data. It was empirical, it was rigorous in its own way, and it fit neatly with the behaviorist psychology that was ruling the day. B.F. Skinner, the famous psychologist, had just published Verbal Behavior in 1957, the same year as Chomsky's book, which is one of those beautiful coincidences of history. And Skinner argued that language was basically a learned behavior, shaped by stimulus and response and reinforcement, the same way you might train a pigeon to peck at a lever. And Chomsky looked at that and said, no, that's not what's happening at all. And here's the thing that made his argument so powerful. It wasn't just philosophical disagreement. He had a logical proof, or something very close to one. He pointed out something that seems obvious once you hear it, but that nobody had quite articulated so clearly before. Every human being, by the age of about 5 or 6, can produce and understand sentences they have never heard before. Think about that. A child who has only been alive for a few years, who has heard a finite number of sentences in their life, can generate an essentially infinite number of new ones. Not just repeat what they've heard, but create brand new combinations that are perfectly grammatical, perfectly meaningful, and completely original. You do this every day without thinking about it. The sentence you're hearing right now, this exact sequence of words in this exact order, has almost certainly never been spoken before in the history of the English language. And yet, you understand it effortlessly. Skinner's model couldn't explain that. If language were just learned responses to stimuli, how could a child produce something they'd never been reinforced for? How could they generalize from a limited set of examples to an infinite set of possibilities? Chomsky's answer was that there must be something innate, some kind of built-in mental machinery that all humans are born with, a set of deep structural rules that allow us to generate and parse sentences in any language. He called this the language acquisition device, and later he refined the idea into what he called universal grammar, the notion that beneath all the surface differences between English and Mandarin and Swahili and Finnish, there are fundamental principles that every human language shares, and those principles are hardwired into our brains. Now, this was a radical claim, and it remains controversial to this day. But let's sit with it for a moment, because the implications are staggering. If Chomsky is right, even partially right, then language isn't just a cultural invention, like pottery or agriculture. It's a biological endowment, like vision or bipedal walking. It's part of what makes us human at the hardware level, not just the software level. And that connects back to everything we were talking about earlier. The hypoglossal canal, the FOXP2 gene, Broca's area. All of those physical structures in your body and brain aren't just happy accidents that happen to support language. They're the infrastructure of a system that evolution has been building and refining for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe longer. But here's where Chomsky's work gets really interesting from an engineering perspective. And I do mean engineering, because what he was describing is essentially a generative system, a set of rules that can produce infinite outputs from finite components. Think of it like a machine. You feed in a vocabulary, a finite set of words, and a grammar, a finite set of rules for combining them. And what comes out the other end is an unlimited number of possible sentences. That's a generative grammar, and the beauty of it is that the rules are recursive. Recursion is one of those concepts that sounds intimidating but is actually pretty intuitive once you see it. It just means that a rule can apply to its own output. So in English, you can take a sentence like, "The dog ran," and you can embed it inside another sentence. "I saw that the dog ran," and you can embed that inside another one. "She told me that I saw that the dog ran," and you can keep going, nesting sentences inside sentences, inside sentences, theoretically, forever. There's no grammatical limit. The only limit is your memory and your patience and the willingness of whoever's listening to keep track of all those embedded clauses. This is what gives human language its extraordinary power. This capacity for infinite embedding, infinite combination. And it's also what separates it most clearly from every other communication system in the animal kingdom. Remember those vervet monkey alarm calls? Each call has one meaning. There's no way to combine them, no way to nest them, no way to modify them. A vervet can't say, "The eagle that was near the tree where the leopard was hiding yesterday." That sentence requires recursion, and as far as we know, no other species on Earth can do it. Chomsky and his collaborators, including Mark Hauser and W. Tecumseh Fitch, actually proposed in a famous 2002 paper that recursion might be the one thing, the single computational operation, that is truly unique to human language. Everything else, the sounds, the learning, the social use, other animals have versions of those. But recursion, that might be ours alone. Now, whether that's exactly right is debated. Some linguists have pushed back. Daniel Everett, for instance, spent decades studying a language called Piraha, spoken by a small group of people in the Amazon, and he claimed that Piraha doesn't use recursion at all, that its sentences are simple and flat and never embed one clause inside another. If that's true, it would be a serious challenge to the idea that recursion is a universal feature of human language. Chomsky's camp has disputed Everett's analysis, and the argument has gotten surprisingly heated over the years. There's real academic drama there, accusations flying back and forth, careers and reputations on the line. But regardless of how that particular debate shakes out, the broader point stands. Human language has a combinatorial structure, a set of rules for building complex meanings out of simple parts, and that structure is extraordinarily powerful. And here's what's really clever about how it works. The rules of grammar aren't just about word order, they're about relationships. When you hear a sentence, your brain isn't just processing a sequence of sounds from left to right, like reading a ticker tape. It's building a structure, a kind of invisible tree of relationships between the words. Linguists literally draw these as tree diagrams, with branches showing which words modify which other words, which phrases are nested inside which other phrases. And your brain does this automatically, unconsciously, in real time, hundreds of times a day. You parse sentences the way your visual system parses a scene, effortlessly, instantly, without any awareness of the staggering computational work happening behind the curtain. So by the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Chomsky's ideas were reshaping not just linguistics, but our entire understanding of the human mind. The cognitive revolution, as it came to be called, was partly a direct consequence of his work. Psychologists started moving away from behaviorism and toward the idea that the mind has internal structures, innate capacities, computational processes that can be studied scientifically. And linguists started asking new kinds of questions. Not just, what do people say, but what is the system that allows them to say it? Not just describing languages, but trying to reverse engineer the underlying machinery. But let's pull back from the theory for a moment and think about what was happening on the ground, or rather, in the mouth. Because while Chomsky was revolutionizing our understanding of syntax and grammar, there's a whole other dimension of language engineering that deserves attention, and that's the sound system itself. Phonology, it's called. The way humans carve up the continuous stream of sound that comes out of our mouths into discrete, reusable units, phonemes, and then stack those phonemes into syllables, and syllables into words. Every language does this differently, and the variation is remarkable. English uses somewhere around 44 phonemes, depending on your dialect. Hawaiian gets by with about 13. And then there are languages like Ta, spoken in Botswana, which has over 100 phonemes, including dozens of click consonants, sounds made by creating suction with the tongue against different parts of the mouth. If you've never heard a language with clicks, it's genuinely startling the first time. Your mouth can make these sounds, your vocal tract is physically capable of it, but if you didn't grow up hearing and practicing them, they feel almost impossible to reproduce. And that tells you something important about language development. There's a window, a critical period in early childhood, when your brain is wiring itself to the specific sound system of whatever language surrounds you. After that window closes, usually somewhere around puberty, learning new phonemes becomes dramatically harder. Not impossible, but harder. That's why adults learning a second language almost always have an accent. Their phonological system was tuned and locked in during childhood, and the new language requires sounds that don't quite fit the template. This critical period idea, by the way, was explored in heartbreaking detail through cases of children who were deprived of language exposure during those crucial early years. The most famous case is a girl known as Jeannie, discovered in Los Angeles in 1970. She had been kept in near total isolation by her abusive father for the first 13 years of her life, strapped to a chair in a dark room, almost never spoken to. When she was finally rescued, linguists and psychologists worked with her intensively, and she did learn words. She built a vocabulary. But she never fully acquired grammar. She could say things like, "Jeannie go store," but couldn't master the recursive, rule-governed structure that 5-year-olds pick up effortlessly. Her case, as tragic as it is, provided some of the strongest evidence for the critical period hypothesis. The idea that there's a biological window for language acquisition, and if you miss it, you can never fully catch up. So think about what all of this means together. You have a species, us, with a vocal tract redesigned by evolution to produce a wide range of sounds, a brain with dedicated regions for processing language, genes like FOXP2 that help wire those circuits, an innate capacity for recursive grammar that comes online in childhood, and a phonological system that gets tuned to whatever language environment the child happens to be born into. It's an engineering marvel, honestly. Millions of years of evolutionary tinkering produced this system, and it works so well that we barely notice it. You're listening to these words right now, and your brain is doing all of this, parsing the sounds into phonemes, grouping them into words, building syntactic trees, extracting meaning, and it feels like nothing. It feels like just listening. But having a spoken language, as extraordinary as it is, has a fundamental limitation. Sound is ephemeral. It vanishes the moment it's produced. You can only communicate with someone who's within earshot, and you can only communicate in the present moment. There's no way to send a message across 100 miles or store a thought for 100 years. For most of human history, that was just the way it was. Knowledge lived in memory, passed from person to person, generation to generation, through the fragile chain of oral tradition. And oral traditions can be remarkably robust. Think of the Homeric epics, which were transmitted orally for centuries before anyone wrote them down, or the song lines of Aboriginal Australians, which encode navigational information across vast landscapes and have been maintained for thousands of years. But memory is fallible. Details shift. stories change in the retelling. And when the last person who knows something dies, that knowledge can vanish forever. So the next great engineering challenge in the history of communication was figuring out how to make language visible, how to take something that exists only as vibrations in the air and turn it into something you can see, something you can touch, something that persists. And the people who first solved that problem lived in a hot, flat, marshy land between two rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, about 5,000 years ago. The Sumerians. And what's fascinating is that they didn't set out to invent writing. They weren't trying to record poetry or preserve myths or send letters. They were trying to keep track of grain. Think about that for a second. The most transformative communication technology in human history, the thing that separates prehistory from history, literally, because history is defined as the period we have written records of. That technology was invented by accountants, or, well, the ancient equivalent of accountants, bureaucrats, people who needed to know how many bushels of barley were going into a temple storehouse and how many were coming out. Around 3,400 BCE, maybe a little earlier, the cities of southern Mesopotamia were growing fast. Uruk was probably the largest city in the world at that point, maybe 40,000 people, which was enormous for the time. And when you have that many people living together, you have an organizational problem. You've got farmers producing surplus grain, and that grain needs to be collected, stored, redistributed, traded. You've got temple complexes functioning as economic centers, managing labor, tracking debts. And you can't keep all of that in your head. You just can't. The complexity of the system outstripped the capacity of human memory, and that gap, that mismatch between what you need to remember and what you can remember, that's what drove the invention of writing. The earliest stage wasn't even really writing in the way we think of it. It was more like a system of tokens. Small clay objects shaped like spheres, cones, discs, each shape representing a specific commodity. A small cone might mean a measure of grain. A sphere might mean a sheep. These tokens go back surprisingly far, maybe to 8,000 BCE, and for thousands of years people used them as a kind of physical counting system. You'd put them in a clay envelope, a hollow ball called a bulla, and seal it shut, and that bulla was your receipt, your record. If there was ever a dispute about how much grain was owed, you could break open the bulla and count the tokens inside. But here's the thing. Once you've sealed the tokens inside a clay ball, you can't see what's in there without breaking it, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a permanent record. So somebody, and we'll never know who, had a clever idea. Before sealing the tokens inside, press them into the outside surface of the bulla so you can see the impressions. Now you've got a record on the outside that matches the tokens on the inside. And then, at some point, somebody realized, wait, if the impressions on the outside contain all the information, why do we need the tokens inside at all? Why not just press marks into a flat piece of clay? And that's essentially how the Cuneiform tablet was born. A flat piece of clay with impressions in it, representing quantities and commodities. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dating to around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE, are exactly this. They're accounting records, lists of goods, inventories. They're not literature. They're not law. They're not religion. They're spreadsheets. Now, these early tablets used pictographic signs, little pictures that looked like the things they represented. A picture of a head meant head. A picture of a bowl with lines coming out of it meant food or to eat. There were maybe 1,000 different signs in the earliest system, which is a lot to learn, and the signs were drawn with a pointed stylus, so they had curved lines, recognizable shapes. But over the next few centuries, something interesting happened. The scribes started using a reed stylus with a wedge-shaped tip, and instead of drawing curves, they pressed the stylus into the clay to make wedge-shaped marks. That's where the name cuneiform comes from. Cuneus is Latin for wedge. And because wedge impressions are faster to make than curved drawings, the signs gradually became more abstract. They stopped looking like the things they represented. The picture of a head became a pattern of wedges that you'd never recognize as a head unless someone told you. And this is where it gets really interesting from an engineering standpoint, because what's happening here is a shift from iconic representation to symbolic representation. The signs are becoming arbitrary. They don't look like what they mean. They mean what they mean because everyone agrees they mean it, which is exactly the same principle underlying spoken language, right? The word tree doesn't sound like a tree. It's an arbitrary association. And once your writing system makes that leap to arbitrary symbols, you've unlocked something powerful, because now you can represent things that don't have a physical appearance. Abstract concepts, verbs, relationships, grammar. The Sumerians developed two key techniques that pushed their system from simple bookkeeping into true writing. The first was the rebus principle. Here's how it works. Imagine you need to write the word life. In Sumerian, the word for life is T. Well, T also happens to be the word for arrow. And you already have a pictographic sign for arrow, so you use the arrow sign to write TI, meaning life. You're using a sign not for what it pictures, but for how it sounds. That's a huge conceptual leap. You're encoding sound, not meaning. You're using the visual system to represent the phonetic system. The second technique was determinatives, extra signs added to clarify which meaning was intended. Because once you start using signs for their sound values, ambiguity creeps in. The same sign might represent multiple words, so you add an unpronounced classifier sign that tells the reader, this word is a type of wood, or this word is a city name, or this word is a person's name. It's a clever engineering solution to an information theory problem. You're adding redundancy to reduce errors in decoding. By around 2600 BCE, cuneiform had evolved into a full writing system capable of recording anything that could be said in Sumerian, and the Sumerians used it for everything. Legal contracts, royal inscriptions, medical texts, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, letters, hymns, proverbs, and, finally, literature. The oldest known literary work in the world is probably the Kesh Temple Hymn, dating to around 2600 BCE, though the one most people have heard of is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was composed in stages over many centuries, with the earliest Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh dating to around 2100 BCE. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment. When you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, or, well, a translation of it, you encounter a mind that feels recognizably human. Gilgamesh grieves his friend Enkidu. He's terrified of death. He goes on a quest for immortality and fails. He comes home and realizes that the walls of his city, the things he built, are the closest thing to immortality he'll ever have. That story is 4,000 years old, and it still resonates because the emotions are universal. And the only reason we know about it is because somebody pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, and that clay dried, and some of those tablets survived, buried in the ruins of libraries and palaces for millennia. Writing didn't just preserve information, it preserved consciousness. It let one human mind reach across thousands of years and touch another. But the Sumerians weren't the only ones working on this problem. Almost simultaneously, and the exact timeline is still debated among scholars, writing was developing independently in Egypt. Egyptian hieroglyphs appear around 3200 BCE, and for a long time, people assumed the Egyptians got the idea from Mesopotamia. But the two systems are so fundamentally different in their structure and appearance that many scholars now believe they were independent inventions, possibly inspired by the general concept of using marks to record information, but developed along completely separate lines. The earliest Egyptian writing shows up on labels attached to goods in tombs, again accounting and administration, and on ceremonial objects like the Narmer palette, which dates to about 3100 BCE and depicts the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Egyptian hieroglyphs are gorgeous, by the way. They're these beautifully detailed pictures of birds, snakes, eyes, hands, water, reeds, and they work through a combination of logographic and phonetic principles, much like cuneiform, but with their own unique architecture. They have uniliteral signs representing single consonants, biliteral and triliteral signs representing combinations, and determinatives, just like Sumerian. But here's a puzzle that has fascinated scholars for over a century. The Egyptians had uniliteral signs for every consonant in their language. They had, essentially, an alphabet sitting right there inside their writing system. They could have simplified the whole thing down to about 24 signs and written everything phonetically. But they never did. They kept the full system, hundreds of signs, for over 3,000 years. Why? Part of the answer is probably aesthetic. Hieroglyphs were sacred. The Egyptians called them Medu Neter, the words of the gods. They were art as much as communication. But part of the answer is also functional. The logographic signs and determinatives actually make the text easier to read, not harder once you know the system. They add layers of meaning and disambiguation that a purely phonetic script would lose. It's a trade-off, harder to learn, but richer in information density. And the Egyptians clearly decided the trade-off was worth it. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the island of Crete around 1800 BCE. The Minoan civilization developed a script we call Linear A, which we still can't read. We don't know what language it encodes. We don't know exactly how it works. It's one of the great unsolved puzzles of ancient writing. When the Mycenaean Greeks took over Crete around 1450 BCE, they adapted the script into something we call Linear B, which was deciphered in 1952 by a young English architect named Michael Ventris. And that's a story worth telling, because Ventris was not a professional linguist or archaeologist. He was an architect who'd been obsessed with Linear B since he was 14 years old, when he attended a lecture by Arthur Evans at the Royal Institution. Evans was the archaeologist who had excavated Knossos and discovered the tablets, and he told the audience that the script was undeciphered. Ventris, who was a teenager in the audience, essentially decided right then that he would be the one to crack it. And he did, 20 years later, working mostly alone, using statistical analysis and pattern recognition, techniques that were remarkably modern for the time. The breakthrough came when he tested the hypothesis that Linear B might encode an early form of Greek, which most scholars had dismissed because the tablets were found on Crete, which wasn't considered Greek territory. But Ventris tried it, and it worked. The tablets turned out to be inventories, again, lists of goods, livestock, offerings. The Mycenaean Greeks were using this script for the same purpose the Sumerians had used cuneiform 2,000 years earlier, keeping track of stuff. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Ventris published his decipherment in 1952 and was killed in a car accident in 1956 at the age of 34. He never got to see the full impact of his work. And there's something about that, about the fragility of individual human lives against the persistence of the things they figure out, that connects back to Gilgamesh in a way. The knowledge survives even when the person doesn't. Now, all of these early writing systems, cuneiform, hieroglyphs, linear B, and others we haven't even touched, like the Chinese oracle bone script from around 1200 BCE or the Indus Valley script that remains undeciphered, they all share a common characteristic. They're complex. They require hundreds or even thousands of signs. Learning to read and write in any of these systems took years of specialized training, which meant that literacy was restricted to a tiny elite: scribes, priests, administrators. The vast majority of people in these civilizations couldn't read or write. Writing was a professional skill, like surgery or metalwork, not a general ability. And that brings us to what might be the single most important innovation in the entire history of writing: the invention of the alphabet. Because the alphabet did something radical. It took the entire sound system of a language and mapped it onto a small set of signs, typically 20 to 30, that could be learned in weeks instead of years. It democratized literacy. And the people who first pulled off that trick lived along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, in a narrow strip of land that is now Lebanon, and they were the Phoenicians. Traders, sailors, and, without ever meaning to be, some of the most consequential engineers of information the world has ever produced. Now, the Phoenicians weren't an empire in the way you might think of Egypt or Mesopotamia. They were a loose confederation of city-states: Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, perched along that narrow coastal strip between the mountains and the sea. They didn't have vast farmland or enormous armies. What they had was timber, specifically the famous cedars of Lebanon, and they had harbors. So they became merchants. They built ships. They sailed everywhere, across the Mediterranean to North Africa, to Sicily, to Spain, possibly even beyond the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic. And when you're a trading civilization, when your entire economy depends on contracts and inventories and bills of lading and correspondence with distant ports, you need a writing system. But here's the thing. You don't need a fancy one. You need a fast one. You need something your merchants can learn without spending a decade in a scribal school. And that economic pressure, that purely practical need, is what drove the invention of the alphabet. It wasn't a philosophical project. Nobody sat down and said, "Let's democratize literacy for the betterment of humankind." It was more like, we need our traders to be able to write things down without hiring a professional scribe for every transaction. The alphabet was a business tool, and that's kind of beautiful when you think about it, because the most liberating information technology in human history was born out of commercial pragmatism. Now, the Phoenician alphabet didn't appear out of nowhere. It had ancestors. The earliest known alphabetic or proto-alphabetic writing comes from the Sinai Peninsula, dating to around 1800 BCE. These are the so-called Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions. They were found in turquoise mines at a place called Sarabit el-Qadim, and they appear to have been carved by Semitic-speaking workers, possibly Canaanites, who were employed or enslaved by the Egyptians. And here's what's clever about what these workers did. They looked at Egyptian hieroglyphs, those beautiful, complex signs, and they borrowed some of the shapes, but they stripped away all the logographic and determinative complexity. They kept only the first sound of each hieroglyph's name. So the Egyptian hieroglyph for house, which in their Semitic language was called Beit, became the sign for the sound B. The hieroglyph for water, which they called Mem, became the sign for M. This principle, using the first sound of a word's name to represent that sound alone, is called acrophony, and it's the key insight that makes an alphabet possible. Think about what that means. Instead of needing a separate sign for every word or every syllable, you just need one sign per consonant sound. And most Semitic languages have around 20 to 30 consonant sounds. So suddenly, instead of learning 600 cuneiform signs or several hundred hieroglyphs, you need to learn maybe 24 simple marks. That's it. That's the whole system. A child could learn it. A merchant could learn it. A sailor could scratch it into a potsherd on a dock in Carthage. The barrier to entry for literacy just collapsed. Now, I should mention something that might surprise you. The Phoenician alphabet, and in fact all the early Semitic alphabets that descended from those proto-Sinaitic scratches, didn't include vowels. They wrote only consonants. This is called an abjad, and it works better than you might expect for Semitic languages like Phoenician, Hebrew, and Arabic, because in those languages the consonant skeleton of a word carries most of the meaning, and the vowels indicate grammatical variations. If you're a native speaker, you can usually figure out the vowels from context. It's a bit like reading English shorthand. If I wrote "P.L.S. send Mr. NFRMTN," you could probably work out, "Please send more information." Your brain fills in the gaps. It's not perfect, but it's efficient, and efficiency was the whole point. By around 1050 BCE, the Phoenician alphabet had settled into a standardized form of 22 consonant signs, written from right to left. And then the Phoenicians did what Phoenicians did best. They traveled. They carried their alphabet across the Mediterranean in their trading ships, and everywhere they went, people saw this system and thought, "That's useful." The alphabet spread not through conquest, but through commerce. It was adopted, adapted, and modified by culture after culture. And here's where the story branches in a way that's genuinely fascinating. The Phoenician alphabet gave rise to almost every alphabet you can think of today. Hebrew and Aramaic descended from it directly. Arabic descended from Nabatean, which descended from Aramaic. The Brahmi script of ancient India, which is the ancestor of Devanagari and Thai and Tibetan and dozens of other South and Southeast Asian scripts, many scholars believe it was influenced by or derived from Aramaic, though that's debated. But the branch that changed the most, the one that had perhaps the most dramatic consequences for world history, is what happened when the alphabet crossed the Aegean Sea and reached the Greeks. The Greeks encountered the Phoenician alphabet sometime around the 9th or 8th century BCE. Greek tradition actually preserved a memory of this. They called their letters Phoenikeia grammata, Phoenician letters, and they attributed the introduction of writing to a legendary figure named Cadmus, who was said to have come from Phoenicia. And the letter names themselves are a dead giveaway. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta. These aren't Greek words. They don't mean anything in Greek. But Aleph means ox in Phoenician, Bet means house, Gimel means camel, Dele means door. The Greeks just borrowed the names along with the shapes, even though the names had lost their original meaning. But here's what the Greeks did that was genuinely revolutionary. They took the Phoenician abjad and turned it into a true alphabet, the first one in history that systematically represented both consonants and vowels. And the way they did it was elegant. Phoenician had several consonant sounds that didn't exist in Greek, guttural and glottal sounds that Greek speakers simply couldn't hear as distinct from each other or from silence. So, the Greeks repurposed those now useless consonant signs as vowel signs. The Phoenician letter Aleph, which represented a glottal stop, that little catch in your throat when you say uh-oh, became the Greek letter Alpha, representing the vowel A. The Phoenician, he became epsilon, the vowel E. Ayin became Omicron, the vowel O. It was a hack, really. They didn't invent new signs for vowels. They recycled consonant signs they didn't need. But the result was transformative. For the first time, you had a writing system that could represent any utterance in a language with complete precision. Every sound had a sign. You didn't need to guess at missing vowels from context. You didn't need to be a native speaker to read it correctly. A complete stranger to the language could, in principle, sound out any word just by knowing the letter-sound correspondences. And that meant the Greek alphabet could be adapted to write virtually any language, not just languages with a convenient consonant root structure. That adaptability is why alphabetic writing conquered the world, and the consequences rippled outward in ways that are hard to overstate. Some scholars, and this is a provocative argument, but it's worth hearing, have suggested that the Greek alphabet, by making literacy genuinely accessible to ordinary citizens for the first time, was a precondition for Athenian democracy. Think about that. If you can read the laws. You can read the arguments. You can participate in public debate as an informed citizen rather than relying on what a priestly class tells you the text says. The connection between widespread literacy and democratic governance isn't a coincidence. It's a causal relationship, or at least a deeply entangled one. From Greek, the alphabet traveled to the Etruscans in Italy, and from the Etruscans to the Romans, who refined it into the Latin alphabet, the one you learned in school, the one I'm using to write these words, the one that's now used to write hundreds of languages across every continent. Meanwhile, the Greek alphabet also traveled northeast and was adapted by Saints Cyril and Methodius in the 9th century CE to create the Cyrillic script for writing Slavic languages. So when you see Russian or Bulgarian or Serbian text today, you're looking at a descendant of those Phoenician merchant scratches filtered through Greek. And I want to pause here for a moment, because there's something worth appreciating about the sheer improbability of this chain. Semitic-speaking miners in an Egyptian turquoise mine around 1800 BCE looked at hieroglyphs and had an idea. That idea was refined by Canaanites, adopted by Phoenician traders, carried across the sea to Greece, modified in a way that made it universal, passed to Rome, and from Rome to you, lying here right now, understanding these words. That's nearly 4,000 years of continuous transmission. The engineering of information encoding, passing from hand to hand to hand, each generation tweaking the design just slightly, optimizing it for their own needs. It's one of the longest unbroken chains of technological inheritance in human history. But the alphabet, as revolutionary as it was, only solved half the problem. You had a brilliant encoding system, a way to turn speech into marks. But what were you making those marks on? Because the medium matters enormously. It shapes what gets written, how much gets written, who can afford to write, how long the writing survives, and the story of writing surfaces, of papyrus and parchment and paper and everything in between, is its own epic, full of trade wars and environmental constraints and accidental discoveries. The Egyptians had papyrus, of course, made from the pith of a reed that grew abundantly along the Nile. It was light, flexible, and you could write on it with ink and a reed pen, which was vastly more pleasant than pressing a stylus into wet clay. Papyrus became the dominant writing surface of the ancient Mediterranean world. The Greeks used it, the Romans used it. The Great Library of Alexandria stored its hundreds of thousands of texts on papyrus scrolls. But papyrus had a problem. It was fragile. It didn't do well in damp climates, and it was essentially an Egyptian monopoly because the papyrus plant grew best in the Nile Delta, which meant that if you were, say, the king of Pergamon in Asia Minor, and you were trying to build a library to rival Alexandria, and the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt decided to cut off your papyrus supply to sabotage your collection, which, according to Pliny the Elder, is exactly what happened around the 2nd century BCE, then you needed an alternative. And the alternative that Pergamon developed, or at least perfected, was parchment, animal skin, carefully prepared, usually from sheep, goats, or calves. Now, people had been writing on leather and animal hides for a long time before Pergamon came along, so the city didn't exactly invent the idea. But what they did was refine the preparation process to a remarkable degree, turning raw animal skin into a writing surface that was, in many ways, superior to papyrus. And the name itself tells the story. Parchment, or in Latin pergamena, literally means the stuff from Pergamon. Here's how you make parchment, and it's worth walking through because the process itself is a kind of quiet engineering. You take a fresh animal skin and you soak it in a lime solution for days, sometimes weeks. The lime loosens the hair and the fat, and it begins to break down certain proteins in the skin while leaving others, mainly collagen, intact. Then you stretch the skin on a wooden frame, pulling it tight, scraping both sides with a curved blade called a lunellum. You scrape off the remaining hair on one side, the flesh on the other. And here's the clever part. While the skin is still wet and stretched, you let it dry under tension. As it dries, the collagen fibers reorganize, aligning themselves along the plane of the surface. What you end up with is not leather. Leather is tanned, chemically transformed. Parchment is something different. It's rawhide that's been refined into a smooth, flexible, remarkably durable writing surface. You can write on both sides. You can scrape off the ink and reuse it, which people did constantly. Those reused sheets are called palimpsests, and some of the most important lost texts in history have been recovered from palimpsests using modern imaging techniques. Archimedes' lost treatises, for instance, were found hiding beneath a medieval prayer book because some monk in the 13th century scraped off the original Greek mathematics and wrote liturgical text over it. Parchment was tougher than papyrus. It survived damp climates. It didn't crack and crumble the way papyrus did when you folded it. And that last point matters more than you might think, because parchment's durability and flexibility enabled one of the most consequential shifts in the history of information technology, the transition from the scroll to the codex. The book, as you know it, pages bound together along one edge with a cover. Now, scrolls had been the standard format for thousands of years. You unrolled them horizontally, reading column by column. They worked fine, but they had real limitations. Finding a specific passage meant physically scrolling through the entire document. You couldn't easily flip to a particular section. You couldn't really annotate the margins without running out of space, and a single scroll could only hold so much text, maybe a single book of Homer's Iliad, or one gospel. For anything longer, you needed multiple scrolls, and then you needed some system for keeping them in order. The codex format, the bound book, solved all of those problems. You could flip to any page. You could write on both sides of every leaf, which roughly doubled your capacity for the same amount of material. You could add page numbers, tables of contents, indices, random access essentially. Think of the difference between a cassette tape and a CD. One is sequential, the other lets you jump to any track. That's roughly the leap from scroll to codex. The transition happened gradually, starting around the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. and it's closely associated with early Christianity. The early Christians adopted the codex format enthusiastically, possibly because it distinguished their texts from Jewish scrolls and pagan literary traditions, possibly because it was cheaper and more practical for communities that weren't wealthy, possibly because the codex made it easier to cross-reference passages between Gospels. Whatever the reason, by the 4th century, the codex had essentially won, and parchment was its ideal medium. Tough enough to be folded, sewn, and bound, smooth enough for fine writing, durable enough to last centuries. Some of the oldest surviving complete manuscripts of the Bible are parchment codices from the 4th century, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus. They're still readable after more than 1,600 years. That's the kind of longevity parchment offers, but it came at a cost. Parchment was expensive. A single large Bible might require the skins of 200 or 300 animals. Think about that. An entire flock of sheep, just for one book. That economic reality shaped medieval literary culture in profound ways. Books were precious objects, often chained to desks in monastery libraries. The labor of copying them by hand was enormous, and the material cost was enormous too. This is one of the reasons literacy remained so restricted throughout the medieval period. It wasn't just that education was limited. The physical materials of reading and writing were genuinely scarce and costly. And this is where paper enters the story, and with it, one of the most important technology transfers in human history. Paper was invented in China, and the traditional date is 105 CE, credited to a court official named Kai Lun during the Han Dynasty. Now, like most invention stories, it's more complicated than that. There's archaeological evidence of paper-like materials in China from the 2nd century BCE, so Kai Lun probably improved and standardized an existing process rather than inventing it from scratch. But the basic technique he's associated with is genuinely ingenious. You take plant fibers, hemp, bark from mulberry trees, old rags, fishing nets, whatever cellulose-rich material you have, and you soak them, pound them, break them down into a slurry of individual fibers suspended in water. Then you dip a fine mesh screen into the slurry, lift it out, and let the water drain through. What's left on the screen is a thin, even mat of interlocking fibers. You press it, dry it, and you have paper. It's beautiful in its simplicity. The raw materials are cheap and abundant. The process is scalable, and the product is light, smooth, takes ink beautifully, and can be produced in enormous quantities compared to parchment. Paper spread through China rapidly, and Chinese paper makers refined the craft over centuries, developing techniques for sizing, treating the surface so ink didn't bleed, and for creating different weights and textures for different purposes. But here's the thing. Paper stayed in China and its immediate cultural sphere for a remarkably long time. The technology didn't reach the Islamic world until the mid-8th century, and the story of how it got there is one of those hinge moments in history that turned on a single battle. In 751 CE, Arab forces of the Abbasid Caliphate clashed with Chinese Tang dynasty troops at the Battle of Talas, in what is now Kyrgyzstan. The Arabs won, and among the Chinese prisoners captured were papermakers. Now, some historians debate the details, whether the knowledge transfer happened exactly this way, whether Arab traders had already encountered paper through Central Asian commerce. But the traditional account holds that these captured artisans taught their craft to their captors, and within a few decades, paper mills were operating in Samarkand, then Baghdad, then Damascus, then Cairo. And this is where it gets really interesting, Because the Islamic world didn't just adopt paper, they ran with it. The Abbasid Caliphate, particularly during the reign of Harun al-Rashid and his successors in the late 8th and 9th centuries, presided over an extraordinary intellectual flourishing. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a center for translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. Scholars like al-Khwarizmi were doing foundational work in algebra and algorithms. His name is literally where the word algorithm comes from. And all of this scholarship, all of this translation and commentary and original research was enabled in part by the availability of cheap, abundant paper. You could produce copies of texts at a fraction of the cost of parchment. Libraries could grow to enormous sizes. The great libraries of the Islamic world held hundreds of thousands of volumes at a time, when a European monastery might own a few dozen books. Paper reached Europe gradually, filtering through Islamic Spain and Sicily. The first European paper mill is generally dated to around 1056 in the town of Zataiva, near Valencia, in Moorish Spain. But European adoption was slow. For centuries, parchment remained the prestige material, and paper was viewed with suspicion. It was flimsier, less durable, associated with the Islamic world. In 1221, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II actually issued a decree declaring that official documents written on paper were invalid. They had to be on parchment. That's how deep the resistance ran. But economics won out, as economics usually does. Paper was just so much cheaper. By the 14th century, paper mills were operating across Italy, France, and Germany. Italian papermakers, particularly in Fabriano, developed crucial innovations. They introduced watermarks for quality control and brand identification. They improved the sizing process using animal gelatin, and they built water-powered stamping mills that mechanized the fiber beating process, dramatically increasing production capacity. By the time the 15th century rolled around, Europe had a well-established paper industry producing affordable writing material in quantities that would have been unimaginable a few centuries earlier. And that matters enormously, because cheap, abundant paper was one of the necessary preconditions for the next revolution. Arguably, the biggest single leap in the history of communication technology. All those paper mills churning out affordable sheets were setting the stage, creating a supply of material that was just waiting for a way to be filled with text faster than a human hand could write. The infrastructure was in place. The demand was there. Europe's population was growing. Universities were multiplying. Commerce was expanding. And the appetite for books was outstripping the capacity of scribes to produce them. Everything was converging toward a breakthrough, and in the 1440s, in the German city of Mainz, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was working on something in his workshop that would change everything. Gutenberg wasn't trying to invent the printing press, not exactly. He was trying to solve a business problem. See, he'd already been involved in a few ventures: mirror making for pilgrims, gem polishing, and he had a craftsman's eye for precision metalwork. What he saw was a bottleneck. Books were expensive because every single page had to be written by hand, letter by letter, word by word, by a trained scribe who might spend months or even years on a single volume. A Bible could take 2 years of steady work, and the demand was enormous. Universities needed textbooks, churches needed liturgical works, merchants needed legal documents. The scribes simply couldn't keep up. Now here's the thing. Printing itself wasn't new. The Chinese had been using woodblock printing since at least the 7th century, and by the 11th century, a man named Bi Sheng had even developed movable type using baked clay characters. Korea refined this further with metal movable type in the 13th century. So the concept was out there. But those systems faced a particular challenge with East Asian writing. Thousands of distinct characters meant you needed thousands of individual type pieces, which made movable type cumbersome compared to just carving a whole page into a single wood block. European languages, though, and this is where the alphabet becomes so important again. European languages used roughly 24 letters. That changes the math completely. With movable type and a small alphabet, you could set an entire page using just a few dozen different letter forms, rearrange them, and print a different page. Gutenberg understood this, probably intuitively rather than through any knowledge of Chinese precedents, which he almost certainly never heard of. But understanding the concept and actually making it work are two very different things. And this is where Gutenberg's goldsmithing background became crucial. The core challenge was creating individual metal letters, type pieces, that were uniform enough to line up perfectly, durable enough to withstand thousands of impressions, and reproducible enough that you could cast hundreds of copies of each letter quickly. Think about what that requires. Each letter has to be exactly the same height, so the printing surface is perfectly flat. The metal has to be hard enough to hold a sharp impression, but soft enough to cast easily. And you need a system for producing them in quantity. What Gutenberg developed was a hand mold, a clever adjustable device that let you cast individual letters rapidly. You'd start with a steel punch, a hard metal rod with the letter carved in relief on one end. You'd hammer that punch into a softer piece of copper to create a matrix, basically a mold of the letter pressed into the copper surface. Then you'd slide that matrix into the bottom of the hand mold, pour in molten metal. Gutenberg used an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony, which had just the right melting point and hardness, and out would pop a single piece of type. You could do this over and over, producing identical copies of each letter. The hand mold was arguably the real invention, the thing that made everything else possible. But he didn't stop there. He also had to develop an ink that would adhere to metal type. Traditional water-based scribal inks just beaded up and slid off. Gutenberg formulated an oil-based ink, probably drawing on techniques from oil painting, which was just becoming widespread in Northern Europe around that time. And he adapted the screw press, a device already used for pressing wine and olives, into a printing press that could apply firm, even pressure across a full page of type. So you've got this convergence of innovations: the hand mold, the metal alloy, the oil-based ink, the adapted press, and cheap paper to print on. Each piece was necessary. Remove any one of them, and the system doesn't work. That's what makes Gutenberg's achievement so remarkable. It wasn't a single flash of insight. It was a complete system, engineered from end to end. He worked on this for years, largely in secret, borrowing money to fund his experiments. And here's where the human drama enters, because Gutenberg's financial situation was precarious the entire time. His primary backer was a wealthy Mainz businessman named Johann Fust, who loaned Gutenberg substantial sums, around 1,600 guilders in total, an enormous amount of money. The arrangement was essentially a business loan, and Fust expected returns. By around 1452, Gutenberg was ready for his masterpiece, a complete Bible, printed in Latin, in 2 columns of 42 lines per page. The Gutenberg Bible, or the 42-line Bible as scholars call it. And it's stunning. If you ever get a chance to see one, there are about 49 surviving copies, some complete, some partial, scattered across libraries and museums worldwide. The quality is breathtaking. The type is crisp and even, The layout is elegant, and many copies were hand-decorated after printing with illuminated initials and rubrication in red and blue ink, so they'd look like the finest manuscripts. Gutenberg was deliberately trying to match the aesthetic standard of handwritten books. He didn't want his printed books to look like something new and cheap. He wanted them to look like something timeless and valuable. He printed roughly 180 copies, about 135 on paper and maybe 45 on vellum. And here's the kicker. Even at that scale, with a technology that was supposed to make books cheaper, each copy still required an enormous amount of work. Setting the type alone was painstaking. Each of those roughly 1,300 pages had to be composed letter by letter, line by line, locked into a frame, inked, pressed, and then the type had to be redistributed and reset for the next page. The whole project probably took about 3 years. But before the Bibles were even finished, disaster struck. In 1455, Johann Fust sued Gutenberg for repayment of his loans plus interest. Gutenberg couldn't pay. The court ruled in Fust's favor, and Gutenberg lost his press, his type, his works in progress, essentially everything. Fust took over the operation, partnered with Gutenberg's former assistant Peter Schoeffer, and they went on to become successful printers. Gutenberg himself faded into relative obscurity. He may have set up a smaller printing operation later, but the details are murky. He died in 1468, not destitute. The Archbishop of Mainz gave him a small pension in his final years, but certainly not wealthy, and without any public recognition for what he'd accomplished. Think about that for a second. The man who engineered arguably the most transformative communication technology since the alphabet itself died without fame or fortune, his life's work taken from him in a lawsuit. It's one of those stories that reminds you how little correlation there sometimes is between the magnitude of an achievement and the reward the achiever receives. But the technology itself, that spread like fire. And the speed of that spread tells you something about how ready the world was for it. By 1470, just 2 decades after the Gutenberg Bible, printing presses had been established in Italy, Switzerland, France, the Netherlands, and beyond. By 1480, there were presses operating in more than 100 European cities. By 1500, an estimated 20 million volumes had been printed across Europe. 20 million. In a world where, 50 years earlier, every single book had been written by hand. The effects were staggering, and they cascaded through society in ways nobody could have predicted. The most obvious impact was on the cost and availability of books. A book that might have cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a skilled laborer could now be produced for a fraction of that. Prices dropped steadily as the technology improved and competition increased. And as books became cheaper, literacy became more practical. There was finally a reason for ordinary people to learn to read, because there was actually something affordable to read. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the printing press didn't just distribute existing knowledge more widely. It fundamentally changed the nature of knowledge itself. Before printing, every copy of a text was slightly different. Scribes made errors, introduced variations, sometimes deliberately edited or corrected passages. No 2 manuscripts of the same work were identical. This meant that scholarship was partly a game of comparison. You'd gather multiple copies and try to figure out what the original actually said. With printing, suddenly you could produce hundreds of identical copies, the same text, word for word, page for page, in the hands of readers across an entire continent. Scholars in Paris and scholars in Venice could discuss the exact same passage, confident they were looking at the same words. This standardization was revolutionary for science, for law, for theology, for any field where precise language matters. Martin Luther understood this instinctively. When he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, or possibly just mailed them to his bishop, the nailing to the door story is debated. The printing press turned what might have been a local theological dispute into a continental movement within weeks. Printers reproduced his theses in enormous quantities. Within a month, copies had reached every corner of Germany. Within 2 months, they were all over Europe. Luther himself was astonished by the speed. The Reformation, whatever you think of its theology, was the first mass media event, and it simply could not have happened without Gutenberg's invention. And Luther pushed the technology further. He wrote prolifically, pamphlets, treatises, hymns, in German, not Latin. This was a deliberate choice to reach ordinary people, and it worked because the printing press could deliver those German-language texts at scale. Between 1517 and 1520, the total output of printed material in Germany increased roughly 7-fold, and Luther authored a significant fraction of it. One man's ideas, amplified by a machine, reshaping the religious and political landscape of an entire civilization. But the printing press also created something subtler, and perhaps even more important. It created the concept of intellectual property, or at least the problem of it. Once you could copy a text cheaply and quickly, who owned the words? Printers would pirate popular works shamelessly, producing unauthorized editions that undercut the original publisher. This led to the first copyright-like protections. Venice granted the first known printing privilege in 1469, giving a specific printer exclusive rights to produce certain works. The struggle over who owns information, who controls its distribution, who profits from it. That struggle starts right here, in the 15th century, and it's still going on today every time you think about digital rights management, or streaming royalties, or open-source software. Now, the printing press also accelerated something we touched on earlier, the standardization of language itself. Before printing, languages were fluid, regional, varied wildly from town to town. English in London sounded and read differently from English in York or Devon. But printers had to make choices. They had to pick a spelling, a grammar, a dialect. And because London was the center of English printing, London English gradually became the standard. William Caxton, who set up the first English printing press in Westminster around 1476, wrestled with this constantly. He wrote about the difficulty of choosing between regional words and spellings, knowing that whatever he printed would be read across the country. His choices, and the choices of printers like him across Europe, slowly crystallized the fluid, shifting thing that was spoken language into something more fixed, more uniform, more standardized. Printed language became a reference point, an authority. The way a word appeared in print became the correct way to spell it. And this standardization fed back into national identity. A shared printed language helped create a shared sense of peoplehood. Benedict Anderson, the political scientist, argued that nations are essentially imagined communities, groups of people who will never meet each other, but who feel connected through shared culture. And one of the most powerful engines of that shared culture was print. When thousands of people read the same newspaper, the same pamphlets, the same novels, in the same standardized language, they begin to feel like they belong to the same community. The printing press didn't just spread information, it helped create the modern nation-state. So from Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz, you can trace a line directly to the Reformation, to the scientific revolution, to the rise of nationalism, to the Enlightenment, to democratic movements built on pamphlets and newspapers. Each of these is a massive topic in its own right, and we could spend hours on any one of them. But the underlying engineering truth is simple. Someone figured out how to reproduce text mechanically, and the world was never the same. For about 400 years after Gutenberg, the basic technology of printing didn't change all that dramatically. There were improvements, certainly. Better presses, better inks, more refined typefaces. The great type designers of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, Claude Garamond, William Caslon, John Baskerville, Giambattista Bodoni, created letter forms of extraordinary beauty and readability, and some of their designs are still in use today. Every time you read something set in Garamond or Baskerville, you're looking at a design that's centuries old, but the fundamental process remained the same. Individual pieces of metal type, assembled by hand, inked, and pressed onto paper. The real transformation came in the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution reached the printing industry, and the key breakthrough was the steam-powered press, developed by Friedrich Koenig, a German inventor working in London. In 1814, the Times of London began printing on Koenig's steam press, and the results were dramatic. It could produce over 1,000 impressions per hour, compared to maybe 250 on a hand press. The Times' publisher, John Walter II, was so worried about his pressmen rioting, they could see their jobs being eliminated, that he installed the new press in secret and only revealed it after the first edition had already been printed. He reportedly told his workers, "The Times is already printed by steam." The age of mass media had begun, and with it came something entirely new in human history. The ability to reach not hundreds or thousands of readers, but millions, tens of millions, and eventually hundreds of millions of people, all reading the same words on the same day, reacting to the same stories. Think about what that means for a second. For most of human history, information traveled at the speed of a horse, or a ship, or a person walking. Now it traveled at the speed of a printing press running through the night, and a railway network distributing bundles of newspapers to every town and village by morning. The newspaper became the first true mass medium, and it changed the relationship between language and power in ways that are still playing out today. But here's the thing. Even as printing was being industrialized, something else was happening that would eventually make the printed word seem almost quaint by comparison. People were figuring out how to send language without any physical medium at all. No clay tablet, no papyrus scroll, no sheet of paper. Just a signal moving through a wire or through the air itself. And that story starts with a painter of all people. Samuel Morse wasn't an engineer or a scientist. He was an artist, a genuinely accomplished portrait painter who had studied at the Royal Academy in London. In 1825, while he was in Washington, D.C., painting a commissioned portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette, he received a letter from his father telling him that his wife Lucretia was ill. By the time a second letter arrived saying she had died, and by the time Morse made it home to New Haven, Connecticut, she had already been buried. He never got to say goodbye. And the thing that haunted him wasn't just the grief. It was the delay, the unbearable slowness of information. A letter had taken days to travel a few hundred miles, and because of that delay, he had missed everything. That experience changed the course of his life. Over the next decade, Morse became obsessed with the idea of instantaneous communication over long distances. He wasn't the only one. Several inventors in Europe were working on similar ideas, and the underlying science of electromagnetism was being explored by people like Michael Faraday and Joseph Henry. But Morse brought something unique to the problem, which was a practical, almost artistic sense of simplicity. He understood that the system didn't just need to work, It needed to be usable by ordinary people. The telegraph, as Morse developed it with crucial help from Alfred Vail and Leonard Gale, was elegant in its engineering. You had a battery providing electrical current, a simple switch, the telegraph key, that the operator could tap to open and close the circuit, a wire connecting two stations, and an electromagnet at the receiving end that would click or mark a strip of paper every time the circuit was completed. That's it. The genius was in the code, Morse code, though Vail probably deserves more credit for its final form than he typically gets. The idea was to represent each letter of the alphabet as a unique sequence of short and long signals, dots and dashes. And here's what's really clever. Morse and Vail didn't assign the codes randomly. They went to a local newspaper's print shop and counted how many of each letter the typesetter had in his cases. The most common letter, E, got the shortest code, a single dot. T got a single dash. The less frequent letters got longer, more complex sequences. It was, in a sense, an early form of data compression, optimizing the system so that the most common messages could be transmitted in the least amount of time. On May 24, 1844, Morse sent his famous first message over a telegraph line strung between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. "What hath God wrought?" a phrase chosen by Annie Ellsworth, the daughter of the Commissioner of Patents. And within a decade, telegraph wires were spreading across the United States and Europe like a nervous system being wired into civilization. By 1866, a telegraph cable had been laid across the Atlantic Ocean, after several failed attempts that are a wild engineering story in themselves, involving ships that snapped cables in mid-ocean, insulation that failed under pressure, and a project that nearly bankrupted several investors before Cyrus Field finally got it right. The telegraph did something to language that's easy to overlook. It created a new kind of writing, telegraph style. Because you paid by the word, people learned to strip their messages down to the absolute essentials. No flourishes, no pleasantries, just the core information. Newspapers that received stories by telegraph developed a writing style, the inverted pyramid, with the most important facts first, specifically because the telegraph connection might cut out at any moment, and you needed to get the crucial details through before you lost the line. That style of news writing is still taught in journalism schools today. The telegraph literally shaped how we structure information, but the telegraph still required a trained operator at each end, someone who could translate between human language and Morse code. The next leap, and this is where it gets really beautiful from an engineering standpoint, was finding a way to transmit the human voice itself. And that brings us to one of the most contested inventions in history. Alexander Graham Bell is the name most people associate with the telephone, and he did receive the patent on March 7th, 1876, just hours before a rival inventor named Elisha Gray filed his own caveat for a similar device. Hours. The priority dispute between Bell and Gray has been argued about for over a century, and there are legitimate questions about whether Bell may have had access to Gray's designs. Antonio Meucci, an Italian inventor working in New York, had demonstrated a working voice communication device years earlier, but couldn't afford the $10 fee to maintain his patent caveat. In 2002, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution recognizing Meucci's contributions, though it stopped short of calling him the inventor of the telephone. The history is genuinely messy, but what matters for our story is the engineering. The basic telephone works by converting sound waves, the pressure variations in the air that your voice creates, into electrical signals, sending those signals through a wire and converting them back into sound waves at the other end. Bell's early design used a diaphragm attached to a needle dipped in acidic water, which varied the electrical resistance as the diaphragm vibrated. Later designs, particularly the carbon microphone developed by Thomas Edison and Emil Berliner, were far more practical. In a carbon microphone, your voice vibrates a diaphragm that presses against a chamber filled with carbon granules. When the granules are compressed, their electrical resistance drops. When they're loosened, resistance increases. This varying resistance modulates an electrical current in a pattern that mirrors the sound waves of your voice. At the receiving end, that varying current drives an electromagnet that vibrates another diaphragm, reproducing the sound. It's remarkably direct. The electrical signal is an analog of the sound wave, a continuous, faithful copy. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so we went from writing to telegraph to telephone. That's a clear progression. But here's what's really interesting about the telephone from a language perspective. It brought back something that writing had taken away. Remember how we talked about all the information that gets lost when you write something down? The tone of voice, the emotion, the hesitation, the warmth. The telephone restored all of that. For the first time since the invention of writing, you could communicate with someone far away and actually hear them. Hear the catch in their voice when they got bad news. Hear the laughter. Hear the pause that meant they were thinking, or the pause that meant they were upset. Language, in a sense, became whole again across distance. And then, almost simultaneously, another technology was being developed that would do something writing had never been able to do: capture the human voice and preserve it in time. Thomas Edison's phonograph, demonstrated in 1877, recorded sound by tracing vibrations onto a cylinder wrapped in tinfoil. The fidelity was terrible. The recordings lasted only a minute or two, and the tinfoil wore out after a few playbacks. But the concept was revolutionary. For the entire history of our species, tens of thousands of years of spoken language, every word anyone ever said vanished the moment it was spoken. Every great speech, every lullaby, every whispered secret, gone. And now, suddenly, you could capture a voice and play it back. Edison reportedly recited "Mary had a little lamb" into his prototype and was startled when it played the words back to him. Even he hadn't fully believed it would work. The phonograph evolved. Wax cylinders replaced tin foil, then flat discs replaced cylinders. Emil Berliner's gramophone made mass production of recordings possible, and by the early 20th century, you could buy a recording of Enrico Caruso singing at the Metropolitan Opera and play it in your living room in Kansas. Language and music, separated from the moment of their creation, made portable, made permanent, or at least as permanent as shellac and vinyl could manage. And all of this, the telegraph, the telephone, the phonograph, was just the warm-up for what came next. Because in the 1890s, a young Italian experimenter named Guglielmo Marconi started playing with something that would change everything yet again. He was working with the electromagnetic waves that Heinrich Hertz had demonstrated a few years earlier, and he had a deceptively simple question. Could you use these invisible waves to send signals without any wires at all? The answer, as Marconi proved with increasing range and reliability through the late 1890s and into the early 1900s, was yes. And the implications were staggering, because for the first time in history, a message didn't need a physical connection between sender and receiver. No tablet carried by a runner, No letter carried by a ship, no wire strung between poles. Just waves, radiating outward through empty space at the speed of light. Marconi's early wireless telegraphy sent Morse code through the air, and its first major application was maritime communication. Ships could now call for help when they were in trouble, which is exactly what happened in April 1912, when the Titanic struck an iceberg and its wireless operators sent distress signals that brought the Carpathia to rescue over 700 survivors. But wireless telegraphy was still code, still dots and dashes, still requiring trained operators. The real revolution came when engineers figured out how to transmit voice and music over radio waves, and that happened gradually through the 1900s and 1910s, with pioneers like Reginald Fessenden, who on Christmas Eve, 1906, broadcast a violin performance and a Bible reading from a transmitter in Massachusetts that was picked up by astonished ship radio operators along the Atlantic coast. By the 1920s, commercial radio broadcasting had arrived, and with it came something that had never existed before in the entire history of human communication. One person speaking, and millions of people hearing those exact words at the exact same moment, not reading a printed copy hours or days later, hearing the actual voice in real time. Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, beginning in 1933, reached an estimated 60 million Americans simultaneously. Winston Churchill's wartime broadcasts unified a nation under bombardment, and on the darker side, Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine understood radio's power with terrifying clarity. The Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, was a cheap radio deliberately designed to be affordable for every German household, because the regime understood that controlling the airwaves meant controlling the narrative. Language had become a weapon of unprecedented reach, and the engineering that made it possible was deceptively simple: a transmitter, an antenna, a receiver, and the invisible ocean of electromagnetic radiation that connects them. The same physics that let sunlight warm your face was now carrying human speech across continents, and the people who understood how to harness that physics held extraordinary power. But radio, for all its reach, was still only sound. You could hear Roosevelt's voice, but you couldn't see his face, couldn't watch his hands grip the edge of the desk, couldn't read the expression in his eyes. And human communication, as we've been tracing all through this long story, has always been more than just words. Remember way back at the beginning, when we talked about how much of meaning lives in gesture, in facial expression, in the tilt of a head? Writing stripped all of that away and gave us permanence in exchange. Radio gave us back the voice, but not the body. The next leap, and it was a massive one, was television, which reunited the voice with the face and gave language a visual dimension that hadn't existed in any broadcast medium before. The engineering behind television is genuinely fascinating, and it involved a cast of characters that reads like a novel. There's Philo Farnsworth, a farm boy from Rigby, Idaho, who at the age of 14, sketched out the basic concept of electronic television for his high school chemistry teacher. The year was 1921. He'd been plowing a potato field, looking at the neat parallel rows behind him, and it hit him that you could dissect an image into parallel lines of light, transmit them one at a time as electrical signals, and reassemble them on the other end fast enough that the human eye would perceive a complete moving picture. A potato field. That's where the idea came from. By 1927, when he was just 21 years old, Farnsworth had built a working electronic television system in a small lab in San Francisco. The first image he transmitted was a simple straight line. When his investors asked when they'd see some return on their money, Farnsworth transmitted a dollar sign. The kid had a sense of humor, but Farnsworth wasn't alone. He was up against the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, and its formidable head of research, Vladimir Zworykin, a Russian-born engineer who'd been working on television concepts since the early 1920s. RCA had enormous resources, corporate backing, and a willingness to fight patent battles that would drag on for years. The legal and technical war between Farnsworth and RCA is one of the great David and Goliath stories in engineering history, and while Farnsworth ultimately won key patent victories, RCA's commercial muscle meant that the corporation largely dominated the rollout of television to the American public. Farnsworth, the genuine inventor, ended up largely forgotten by the public for decades. He struggled with depression and alcoholism. When he appeared on the TV game show I've Got a Secret in 1957, none of the panelists could guess his secret: that he'd invented the very medium they were appearing on. Think about that for a second. The man who made television possible was anonymous to television's own audience. Television changed language and communication in ways that are hard to overstate. The 1960 presidential debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon is the textbook example. People who listened on radio thought Nixon won on substance, but people who watched on television saw a tanned, relaxed Kennedy next to a pale, sweating Nixon, and they gave the debate to Kennedy. The visual dimension of communication, which had been absent from every mass medium since the invention of writing, was suddenly back, and it mattered enormously. Politicians, advertisers, and public figures had to relearn how to communicate. It wasn't enough to have good words or even a good voice. You needed presence. You needed to look trustworthy. The body had re-entered the conversation, broadcast to millions, and television did something else that's worth pausing on. It created shared visual experiences on a scale that had never existed. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface on July 20th, 1969, an estimated 600 million people watched it happen simultaneously. 600 million pairs of eyes, seeing the same grainy image, hearing the same words. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. At the same moment, no event in the previous history of human communication had ever unified that many minds in a single shared experience. Language, image, and real-time transmission had converged into something almost overwhelming in its power. But here's the thing about radio and television. They were fundamentally one-directional. A few people broadcast, and millions received. The flow of language was asymmetric. You could listen to Roosevelt, watch Kennedy, absorb the evening news, but you couldn't talk back. You were an audience, not a participant. The printing press had a similar dynamic. Publishers published, readers read. For most of the history of mass communication, the architecture was one to many, and the many were essentially silent. That began to change with a technology that, at first, seemed to have nothing to do with communication at all. Computers were built to calculate, not to talk. The earliest electronic computers, machines like ENIAC, completed in 1945 at the University of Pennsylvania, were room-sized behemoths designed to compute artillery firing, tables, and later to crack codes and model nuclear weapons. They processed numbers, not words. But here's what's really clever about the underlying engineering. At the deepest level, a computer doesn't actually distinguish between numbers and letters. Everything is just patterns of ones and zeros, binary digits, bits. And if you assign a specific binary pattern to each letter of the alphabet, suddenly a machine that was built to crunch numbers can also store, transmit, and manipulate text. That's exactly what happened with ASCII, the American Standard Code for Information Interchange, finalized in 1963. It assigned a 7-bit binary code to each character. The letter A was 10000001. B was 10000010, and so on. It was arbitrary, it was simple, and it turned every computer into a potential communication device. The moment computers could handle text, the stage was set for networking them together. And the story of how that happened is tangled up with Cold War anxiety in a way that's almost poetic. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, was created by the U.S. Department of Defense in 1958, partly in response to the shock of Sputnik. The worry was that a Soviet nuclear strike could knock out centralized communication systems, so researchers began exploring decentralized network architectures, ways of routing information that didn't depend on any single hub. Paul Baran at the Rand Corporation proposed packet switching in the early 1960s, independently of Donald Davies in the UK, who came up with the same concept around the same time. The idea was beautifully simple. Instead of sending a message as one continuous stream along a single path, the way a phone call works, you break the message into small packets, each labeled with its destination address, and let each packet find its own route through the network. If one path is blocked or destroyed, the packets route around the damage. It's resilient, it's flexible, and it's the fundamental architecture that still underlies the internet you use every single day. ARPANET, the first operational packet switching network, sent its first message on October 29, 1969, just a few months after the moon landing. A programmer at UCLA named Charlie Klein tried to send the word login to a computer at Stanford Research Institute. The system crashed after transmitting just 2 letters, L and O. So the first message ever sent over what would become the internet was, unintentionally, LO, as in, lo and behold. You can't make this stuff up. From that modest beginning, networking grew. Slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Email was invented in 1971 by Ray Tomlinson, who chose the @ symbol to separate the username from the computer name, a decision so casual he later said he couldn't really remember making it. Usenet, bulletin boards, chat rooms, through the 1970s and 1980s, a culture of text-based online communication developed, mostly among academics and hobbyists. But the real explosion came in the early 1990s with the invention of the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee, a British computer scientist working at CERN in Switzerland. What Berners-Lee created wasn't the internet itself, the network infrastructure already existed, but rather a system of hyperlinked documents that made the internet navigable and usable by ordinary people. HTML, URLs, HTTP. These were the engineering tools that turned a military academic network into a global communication platform. And Berners-Lee, in a decision that echoes through everything we've discussed about the democratization of communication, chose not to patent or charge for his invention. He gave it away. Like the alphabet itself, the web became a commons. And now, for the first time since the invention of language itself, the architecture of communication flipped. It was no longer one-to-many. It was many-to-many. Anyone with an internet connection could publish, broadcast, respond, argue, create. The printing press had lowered the barrier to publication, but it still required a press, ink, paper, distribution. Radio and television required transmitters, licenses, enormous capital investment. The web required a computer and a connection. And as those costs plummeted, as smartphones put a connected computer in nearly every pocket on Earth, the ability to communicate broadly became, for the first time in history, nearly universal. Think about what that means in the context of everything we've traced together tonight. For tens of thousands of years, human language was ephemeral, spoken, heard, gone. Writing made it permanent but locked it behind the barrier of literacy and the scarcity of materials. Printing made it reproducible but still required institutional infrastructure. Radio and television made it instantaneous but kept the power to broadcast in the hands of a few. And now, in the span of barely a single generation, all of those barriers fell simultaneously. You can type a sentence on your phone, and it can be read by someone on the other side of the planet within seconds. You can record your voice, your face, your ideas, and share them with potentially billions of people for free using technology that fits in your palm. The entire arc of communication engineering, from Sumerian clay tokens to fiber optic cables pulsing with light, has been a story of expanding who gets to speak and who gets to listen. And that brings us, gently, to where we are right now. Because the latest chapter in this story is still being written, and it involves something that would have seemed like pure fantasy to every engineer and linguist we've talked about tonight. Machine learning and artificial intelligence are beginning to process, generate, and translate human language in ways that blur the line between human communication and something else entirely. Neural machine translation can now convert between languages with a fluency that would have stunned the scholars who spent lifetimes deciphering the Rosetta Stone. Large language models, trained on vast oceans of text scraped from the very web that Berners-Lee built, can produce coherent, contextually appropriate language that is, at times, genuinely difficult to distinguish from human writing. We've engineered systems that don't understand language the way you and I do. They don't have experiences, don't feel the weight of words. But they can manipulate linguistic patterns with extraordinary sophistication. Whether that constitutes a new form of communication or merely a very convincing simulation is a question that philosophers and engineers are still wrestling with, and honestly, it's a question that might not have a clean answer. But here's what strikes me. Lying here thinking about all of this, following this thread from the first hominid who pointed at something and made a sound that another hominid understood. Every single technology we've talked about tonight, every clay tablet, every alphabet, every printing press, every telegraph wire, every radio wave, every glowing screen, all of it has been in service of the same fundamental human need, the need to take something that exists inside one mind and get it into another mind. That's it. That's the whole story. A thought, a feeling, a warning, a joke, a declaration of love, a cry for help, trapped inside one skull. And the entire history of communication engineering has been about building bridges between skulls. Better bridges, faster bridges, bridges that span greater distances and last longer and carry more nuance. And the beautiful thing, the thing that I keep coming back to, is that the most sophisticated communication technology ever engineered is still the one you were born with, your voice. Your ability to modulate air pressure with a larynx and a tongue and a pair of lips, shaping breath into meaning. Every technology since then has been an attempt to extend what your voice can do, to make it carry farther, last longer, reach more people. But the voice came first, and it remains, even now, the most intimate and immediate way that one human being can reach another. So as you lie there, maybe drifting, maybe already somewhere between waking and sleep, think about that. Think about the fact that language, this invisible, weightless, impossibly complex system that you use without even thinking about it, is the single greatest collaborative engineering project our species has ever undertaken. No one designed it. No committee approved it. It emerged, it evolved, it was shaped by millions of minds over tens of thousands of years, and it carries within it the traces of every culture, every migration, every conquest, every love story, every argument, every lullaby ever whispered to a child in the dark. It's in you right now, even as these words settle into your mind and begin to blur at the edges. The words are doing what they've always done, crossing the space between us, carrying something from my mind to yours. And that, when you think about it, is pretty extraordinary. So let them carry you now, gently, wherever you're going. The story of language is never really finished. It just keeps going, one word after another, one voice reaching for another across all the distance and all the silence, finding its way through.